I'd like to talk a little bit about Yiddishkeit, the comic. You did that with Harvey Pekar.
Yes, Harvey Pekar. Usually not the pronunciation on the last syllable. Pekar. He used to say after, if you're on a train, after the beer car comes the Pekar. Typical Harvey humor. At any rate, it was in this period, I was developing book ideas with and for Harvey. And I would approach a publisher knowing that Harvey would write a majority of the script for the book, and that the last third of the book would be, instead of one artist, his choice, would be various artists, my choice. And I would either have those artists write things for themselves or script for themselves, or I would script for them. And so we did, I think, 4 books like that. So Yiddishkeit was my idea, but Harvey loved to learn new things. His hangout was the Cleveland Public Library. And once we had decided on this, he read every novel, Yiddish novel recently translated, which were a lot. There were a lot of translations in that recent decade, things that had not been available to me in 1980 or 1990. So he just dived into it. He was an autodidact from the time he was a child, dropped out of college, didn't have any formal training in anything, but was a natural storyteller. And I knew from the beginning that he would have this overall narrative that might even be wrong in places, or at least misjudged in places, and unacceptable in places, like his very bitter criticism of I.B. Singer, for instance. I agree with it, but it's unpopular. But which would be forceful, interesting to readers, mainly Jewish, but by no means entirely Jewish, who were curious about the subject, and compelling as a narrative. Now, I found the artist for that, and the first time that happened for us. And I found the other artists for the book, which is quite a bit. They were either my old friends, or in a couple of cases, young people that I found and got interested in this stuff. And my task was to oversee everything, as it always is with comics. And then I would okay it with Harvey, would basically say, okay, and focus on his own work. And sometimes I would suggest themes that hadn't been in his work. For instance, I said, Harvey, we have to have something on klezmer, because Henry Sapoznik wanted to do something, fell through. Okay, we're in the last 2 months. We got to have something in klezmer. Harvey sat right down and wrote a script, and one of my favorite artists drew it, and that's how it went. A crucial contributor is Herschel Hartman, who performs ceremonies of all kinds in Los Angeles as a sort of professional Yiddishist, retired salesperson. But for 20 years or more, he's done these things and was a reporter at the Morgan Freiheit in 1950. The first person, I think he said, to have gotten a PhD at Columbia, studying with the great figures of Yiddish literature. So he checked everything, put his kosher stamp on almost everything. Some things he objected to because they weren't in modern YIVO Yiddish spelling, a source of conflict, since I'm more eclectic and you might say indifferent on that issue, or at least flexible, a better way to put it. And after him, probably we, age 82, 81 when he was working on it, we retreat to my generation and a little older, Spain Rodriguez, who's taken up with Joel Schechter, theater professor at University, San Francisco State, who's in his mid-60s. Sharon Rudahl, a really interesting person who was the outstanding figure in women's underground comics in the 70s, along with Trina Robbins, another left-wing person who didn't contribute to this book. But Sharon was the first one to draw women's comics about Jewish historical life in the old world. And now, not a lot of them, but very, very good. And I remember reading them in the middle 1970s and thinking, boy, this is really great stuff. One of the best strips in the book, this is hard to say what's the best strip, and I collaborated on it, so I'm suspicious of myself. But a guy named Torkelson, who had a grandfather that's Jewish, that's about it for his Jewishness, but who was one of the very early underground comics artists in Madison, Wisconsin, as a matter of fact, and a community artist in Boston with various publications, and social activist in Boston with various progressive publications for 30 years. His name is Nick Torkelson. I drew him into this idea of writing about the Yiddish press, and especially of this much forgotten Yiddish anarchist literary critic, Baruch Rifkin, whose daughter I interviewed, as noted in the comic. And he fell right into it. And because we had color, he was able to do some extraordinary stuff with those pages, summarizing or pulling together the importance of immigration for Yiddish literature like nobody else could in 5 pages. I mean, I was some assistance to him. I would say, go to this source, or I would translate a page from Yiddish, from Rifkin, and say, here, or David Ignatov, and say, here's a paragraph of this. This will give you a sensibility, because this particular thing has never been translated to my knowledge. And having that much, he just jumped into it. And what he did is so very, very useful for the initiative and initiate, and for those of us who are quite advanced, is as an artwork, perhaps expressive of what I've been trying to do with comics in the last 10 years. What am I trying to do with comics which are mainly read by people under 30? And now finally with the rise of manga read by women under 30, which was something that was rare before 10 or 15 years ago. His strip, not to take anything away from the others, is pretty representative of what I'm trying to do, both in being educational and saying, look, this is what comic art can do. Comic art can do a lot, and we need to think about that.